A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome to this episode of Shariah Intelligence, where we are looking specifically at the universal maxims, the qawaid al-fiqhiyah of Islamic jurisprudence. With me to discuss today's topics are two of our top facilitators and volunteers with the Da'wah Institute, Sister Salatu Suleh and Brother Ibrahim Bello. You're both most welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The first question I'd like to look at, we've started discussing this last time. We had an overview of the subject of Islamic legal maxims. Sister Salatu, let's start looking at the first of these maxims, al-umur bimaqasidiha, that matters are judged according to the purposes they fulfill. Could you tell us more about this maxim? What are the implications of this maxim? What does it mean to start with? What values does it promote? And how was this exercised, or how do we see this maxim alive in the time of the Prophet and his companions?
Okay, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. The first maxim, al-umuru bimaqasidiha, it's the maxim that promotes the values of being concerned about the consequences of actions, the consequences of the choices we make, the consequences of rulings for jurists, or of policies that are made for those who are in the position to make policies, for decision makers, for people who make rules even within organizations, and then at a very at a personal level, for concern about the consequences of one's choices, one's actions. Now, this maxim, when we look at the wording and then we break that down to understand, al-umur it's referring to matters, and matters would be the umbrella term for all those things I've just listed. So it could be the instructions that are given, it could be a ruling that says something should be prohibited even. So it's a very broad term saying everything. That's how I usually understand it, even that once you say al-umur, matters, meaning everything. Now they go with, that is, they are judged by, they are based on. Before you decide this is what I want to do, then you should look at the matter and look at the maqasid. Here we look at maqasid as having two layers of meaning. There is the side where you are talking about the intention. The person who's taking the action, who's making the decision, who's making this policy. What is the person's intention? What is the person's intended outcome or purpose? So what is that outcome that the person has in mind? The other layer of meaning is what is the, you might call it the real purpose, or the actual purpose, or the foreseeable purpose. And the reason why there's this distinction between these two layers of meaning is that I might take an action and I have a purpose in mind. When I carry out the action, the outcome may be the opposite of what I intended. So the maxim is simply saying that when it comes to how matters are weighed or assessed, when it comes to how matters are judged, whether something should be done or not done, the question should be, what was the intention of the doer, or what is the intention of the doer, and what is the possible consequence of that action itself. Now let's look at some implications that arise from this. When we look at certain actions, what kind of ruling would a judge make? What kind of ruling will the mujtahid come up with, or have they come up with? It would depend not just on the matter itself, the action itself. It would depend on the intent or the motive. If we look at criminal law, the Sharia criminal law, that aspect of it, there's a distinction, just as in common law, between murder and manslaughter. And that distinction is based on the motive. The action itself that led to the killing of that person is what creates liability. The degree of liability comes from, was the motive to actually kill this person, or was the motive more accidental? For instance, someone who is driving a car and hits a pedestrian and the pedestrian dies, for example. Or two people are involved in an argument, a quarrel, and they get into a fight, one punches the other and the person dies. These are some of those considerations. So here is where we are saying that the motive itself is pivotal. in the conclusion of how is this matter to be judged or assessed. And this is based on, as we mentioned earlier, verses of the Quran, hadith that indicate that even in Allah's sight, when it comes to what are those actions Allah accepts, what are those actions that Allah overlooks or forgives, it's tied to what is the intention that drives or powers the action. Another thing to note here is when it said that you have to also look at the consequence. The consequence should be something that is probable or foreseeable or likely to occur. This is where one has to then start asking before a decision is made, before a choice is made, before an instruction is given. The person responsible for taking that step should, by all means, activate their own intellect, activate their understanding of the situation, gather more knowledge about the context, consult with people of understanding and people of knowledge. That is what we talk about today when we say impact assessment. Before a government does something, maybe establishes a housing estate or creates a park or starts mining in a particular area, it would be useful to say, what's the impact assessment? Has it been done? That's now concern for consequences that are probable or likely. And we know what is probable through exploration. For those who are familiar with common law, they will talk about, what a reasonable man would expect. Is it something that anybody of average common sense, as they say, would expect to see? Sometimes people hide behind the intention to carry out an action that in itself is not beneficial. They would say, the end justifies the means. So they will actually work backwards. This is not the case with this maxim. This maxim is saying the intention and the outcome. So both the amr and the maqsad, these two are important. They have to both be put on the scale. If an action is not, it's prohibited, for instance, we cannot cleanse it as a general rule by saying, oh, but what I intended was a good thing. No. Sometimes I think once when somebody was discussing this issue of people getting together to have a drink, alcoholic drinks, and they said, because it makes people mellow, they get more friendly, it helps with bonding. And that made me remember what Allah said in the Quran about khamr, where he said, khamr and maisir, there's some benefit in them, but the harm outweighs the benefit. Therefore, stay away from these things. So the question again is, you say the consequence. What is the ultimate outcome of this? So good intention will not legitimize something that's haram. That's clear. If an action is good and the intention is good, all is fine. If an action is good, but the outcome is bad, then the ruling would be stay away from that. So they have to both be aligned with it. Of course, if an action is good and the outcome is bad, it would affect the gravity that is attributed to that action, which is the example I gave of manslaughter and murder. When we are assessing these things, there is something to remember, the saying, فَحْكُمْ بِمَا ظَهَرَ. You would make decisions based on what is clear to you. So this maxim does not impose upon us the liability for things that are beyond our capacity. And so we are talking about cognitive capacity, mental capacity, capacity of what we are able to foresee or predict or guess, if I can use that term. By looking at these different things, the jurists in making conclusions, governments in making policies, individuals in making choices, try to then stay as close as possible to the spirit and the purpose of Islam. This maxim actually helps to promote thoughtful action, not just action. Sometimes they say be proactive, and for some people, be proactive means take action. Don't even slow down, just take action. No, this particular maxim is saying take action that's thoughtful, where you have thought about, you've looked forward, so a forward-looking approach. a concern for what will happen tomorrow if I take this action today, what will happen to that community if this decision is made, what will happen to that group if this ruling is what is given. It also emphasizes the need to purify one's intention, because intention is not static, it shifts. So you might start off taking an action that is a good one with an intention that is clean, it's good. It makes the matter acceptable to Allah. It makes it worthy of Allah's blessings. And the outcome is also beneficial. But if one's intention shifts along the way, shifts from seeking Allah's pleasure to seeking the approval of people, it then erodes that quality of the action itself. And lastly, the implication of this maxim helps us understand that you might do an action that is classified as mu'amalat, meaning this is not about worshipping Allah, it's just normal everyday transactions. But the intention behind why you're doing it, where you then connect a mu'amalat, everyday action, an ordinary action, to your connection with Allah, increasing your bond with Allah, would elevate that action from ibadah, from mu'amala level to ibadah level for you because of your intention. So intention is powerful. The outcome we seek is powerful as well.
Thank you very much. There's two sides of the maxim where you are looking both at, on the outside, what we can judge, and we can't judge the heart. And we look at consequences, we look at the purpose of this action, we look at the maqasid or the mafasid that will be realized by this action. Is it going to bring good, or is it going to bring harm? And of course, we will say this is a good plan, or this is a good action, or this is a good program, or good institution based on its outcome, or this is a good law based on the consequence, or we say it's bad based on that. But also the issue of intention, that also matters. And if we can assess whether the intention was good or bad, that is helpful. But if we can't, then that's really not our business. We will block any action that will cause harm.
So we
will
look at
promote
the probable outcome.
Exactly. How was this maxim applied during the life of the Prophet, Malam Ibrahim? Can we look at instances where this issue of the judging of an activity is tied to the maqasid, the objective, the purpose?
Yeah, it is true, and like you earlier stressed, this whole issue of goal or purpose-oriented mind on whatever you want to do is critical in Islam, because number one, God will judge you based on the innermost intent. Of course, we leave that to Him alone. But then outwardly, you will be judged based on the purpose that action seeks to fulfill. Now, during the lifetime of Rasulullah, practically in a number of issues, he took decisions that were more like his concern for the consequence. Let me start with, there was a time the Prophet ﷺ went to preach in Ta'if when Meccans were against him. They stoned him and he had some injury, and an angel came around, according to the hadith, seeking his permission to perish the people of Ta'if. But he said, no. My intent, my hope, my goal is if they don't believe in Allah, they should have descendants and children that will serve Allah. So you see that kind of foresight. Similarly, during the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, he came to Mecca planning to do Hajj, and at the entrance of Mecca, they had disagreement with the Meccans. And it took him 19 days negotiating, and all sorts of terms that apparently were not in favor of Muslims. But because he has a foresight, he's looking at the concern for peace, for future political stability, looking at the strength of Muslims and Islam now, and all of that he accepted. Another thing was, like he was telling Aisha, that I had wanted restructuring Kaaba.
So, sorry, just before you go on the restructuring.
Yeah.
So in the case of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah,
Yeah.
even though some of the terms of the treaty
Yeah.
you would say were not very Islamic.
That's why I
You
say
know,
we're against, we're not
exactly,
in favor of
we're not
Muslims.
in favor of.
Yeah.
But the concern for the consequences showed that it was actually, if you think in the long term,
Exactly.
of greater benefit than the little concessions that you otherwise would not have done. So this concern for the consequences.
Exactly.
Sorry.
And that goes
Aisha.
along to say leaders too should have that kind of foresight. It's not necessary that people will understand you now. But once you are clear of what you want to achieve, you're fine. History will forgive you. Now you have this idea of also restructuring Kaaba. He was relating to Aisha that I had wanted restructuring Kaaba to its original form built by Ibrahim. And sometime in history, it collapsed, and when they wanted to rebuild for some economic and what have you reasons, they couldn't complete it. And all they did, for those that will go for Hajj, you see where they mark out like a semicircle, and they call it Hajr Ismail. So the Prophet said, but I was afraid of the ignorance of your people. They might misunderstood me. So look at that. You're afraid of being misunderstood. That concern for consequence. And so that people don't get you now and interpret you wrongly, so you take caution.
So he was looking at the fact that some of these have only just embraced Islam.
Yeah.
They're still new to Islam.
Of course.
And he is concerned about how their ignorance would make them interpret his actions.
Yeah, in a number of issues. You know, there was a time he was on itikaf, and one of the wives visited. So while he was seeing her off around that night period after Isha, a Sahabi passed by and noticed it was a prophet with a lady somewhere in darkness, and the man tried to hasten up. The prophet said, come. This is my wife. Like you clarify. So this issue of intention matters, but sometimes they need to also you have a number of cases. There were instances where hypocrites were not punished for their wrongdoing. Why? Nobody will understand. They will think Muhammad is killing his followers. So he tried to look at, wait first, these people deserve to be killed because the harm they cause to Islam and Muslims is more grievous than that of the unbelievers.
Like treason.
Treason, of course.
Yeah.
Similarly, the Prophet ﷺ suspended hudud, hard punishments during warfare. Why? Because you will give the enemy upper hand and a chance of some bad guys among you running to join the enemy. So during hudud, punishments are suspended.
During warfare.
Hudud, exactly.
Yeah.
Hudud is suspended during warfare. You also have this case of Taraweeh. The Prophet has actually started Taraweeh prayer when Ramadan was mandated, the second year after Hijrah. But he was like, this is still the time when Allah is still making legislation. Let's not continue and it becomes binding. So he held on. He stopped. And when asked, he said, I was afraid. If we continue and Allah shouldn't come and send revelation, making it binding. In another hadith, he even mentioned that, لَوْلَا أَنَا شُكَّ عَلَىٰ أُمَّتِي لَا أَمَرْتُهُمْ بِالسِّوَاكِ عِنْدَ كُلِّ صَلَاةٍ وَمَعَ كُلِّ وُضُوءٍ. Had it not been for the fear of I might be too strict or make life difficult, so to say, for my ummah, I would have just say, do siwak. But if it becomes binding, then I'm afraid.
Brush your teeth.
Brush your teeth.
Before prayers.
It becomes a burden, and you'll be held to account if you cannot. So all these and a number of similar examples of many instances where the Prophet ﷺ was focus-oriented, purpose-oriented, and then he tried to show that all his actions actually have direction. You also have cases where he wanted prohibiting azl. Azl, this you call coitus interruptus, where a man will have intimacy with his wife. At the point of discharging or releasing, he withdrew. But the Prophet ﷺ said, well, when I look at some cultures and they are fine with it, I permitted it. Something like gila also. Gila in Arabic means having intimacy, sexual intimacy with a lactating mother. And then, like, sometimes people have this kind of superstitious belief that it will affect the child, it will do this and that. The Prophet was less concerned with that, but he tried to look around other cultures that do it. And he discovered they were fine, and so he permitted it. So all of these are practical application of al-umuru bi maqasidiha and many more that the Prophet ﷺ actually implemented in practical terms.
This is interesting, and it reminds me of one of the Sahaba, Samura, and his son, who was, who was overeating and was very obese. And the Prophet said if he dies due to that, it would be considered a suicide. In other words, this concern for what you're doing now and how what you're doing now, what the consequence is, and the fact that you control it, how it affects the judgment of things. Could you give us certain specific texts? So these show the authority of this maxim as it, in action, that there's always been a concern for consequences as there's been a concern for intention. But are there particular texts of the Quran or Hadith that you would give that support this maxim of al-umur bimaqasidiha, matters judged by their purposes?
Yeah, a number of them. And in fact, if we look at Quran very well, we discover that this issue of al-umur bimaqasidiha is at the core of the theme of Quran, between you and God and between you and other people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called himself alimun bidhati sudur. He knows what is in your hearts. Qul in tubdu ma fi anfusikum aw tukhfuhu ya'lamuhu Allah. That if you explain or speak out what's in your mind, or you hide it, God still knows, and he will judge you according to what you know.
That's inside.
Exactly. Also, you have a verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say, La yu'akhidhukum Allahu bil-lagwi fi aymanikum, walakin yu'akhidhukum bima kasabat qulubukum. Allah will not hold you to account with vain talks, mistakes you make in your oath. Scholars will say lagwul yamin is a chapter in fiqh, where somebody is coming from far, dressed like a man, and you say, I swear by God, that's a man coming. Based on what you know, this is called lagwul yamin. Allah says he doesn't hold you to account because it is not deliberate. Okay? So, this whole issue of intention. Other verses include when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَسُبُّ الَّذِينَ يَدَعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. Do not castigate their demigods. فَيَسُبَّ اللَّهَ عَدْوًا بِغَيْرِ إِلْمٍ. They end up castigating your own gods out of ignorance. And then you have other verses like this issue of whatever you do, Allah will reward it. Al jazaa'ul ihsan illa al ihsan. Meaning the only consequence for kindness is kindness. Okay. So all of these and many other verses of Quran, like I say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say, Alamu kha'inatal a'ayuni wa ma tukhfi sudur. Allah knows which eye is deceitful, who is deceiving, and what is actually in the mind. So these are verses of Quran. Of course, you have a number of ahadith also. The hadith, the Prophet was very clear. He said, Innamal a'amalu bin niyat, or Innamal amalu bin niyah. All of these you have riwayat for them. Meaning actions are judged according to intention, according to the role they seek to fulfill. He also said, Man hamma bihasanatin fa'amilaha, falam ya'amalha. That if you intend doing good and you've not done it, Allah will reward as if you've done it. If you do it, He multiply it tenfold. And then you have a hadith like Yaghzu Jayshun Kaaba. He said a group of army will attempt attacking Kaaba. At a point somewhere, إِذَا كَانُوا بِبَيْضَاءَ مِنَ الْأَرْضِ, when they got somewhere before Kaaba on a plain ground, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will cause the earth to swallow them. Aisha understood that will swallow all the nearby, because earthquake doesn't select. And she was like, Ya Rasulallah, كيف يخصف بأولهم وآخرهم وفيهم أسواقهم ومن ليس فيهم. How? Like, Ya Rasulallah, you mean they will be perished, including their markets and innocent people? The Prophet said, yes. يخصف بأولهم وآخرهم ثم يبعثون على نياتهم. Allah will perish them, but then they shall be raised according to their intention. You also have a hadith of Rufi al-Kalama and Salas. Allah said the pen, like there's no sin on three categories of people. A child who is not intellectually or mentally mature, somebody sleeping, and somebody who is insane. In another hadith he said, Inna Allah tajawaza li an ummati al-khata'u wa nisyan wa mastukrihu alayh. Allah has forgiven my ummah what they did by mistake. It's not intentional, because it's intention that counts. Wa nisyan, what they forgot. Of course, wa mastukrihu alayh. Like under duress, at gunpoint, this is still not your own. If Islam has it to the extent that somebody was forced to commit blasphemy, like the case of Ammar. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent a verse. The popular case of Ammar, whose parents were killed because of Islam. And it got to his turn. He could see what was done to his parents. And they say, commit blasphemy or we kill you. And he did. And when he reported himself to the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, this is what happened. I am gone. This is what I have done. And the Prophet said, how did you feel right inside you when you said it? He said, well, I felt I was with faith. I was just doing that to save my life. And Allah sent down a verse. Man kafara billahi min ba'di imanihi illa man ukriha. You know, that it will be wrong and blasphemous and damaging for anybody to disbelieve except somebody who is forced. So you have many ahadith of the Prophet, too numerous actually to recount on these issues of intention matters. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say also, the Prophet will say, Man ra'a minkum munkaran falyughayyirhu biyadihi. Whosoever sees an abomination or anything going wrong should attempt changing with his hand. That's if you have authority, of course. It's not literally hand. For illam yastati, if you cannot, then for bilisani, he says speak out. But then if for illam yastati you cannot, he said for biqalbi, show right from your mind. God knows that you don't like it. So if Allah will recognize, and the Prophet will even give instruction to the extent that if you are so weak, right from you hate and detest that thing, Allah will still reason and understand with you. Then it means that intention, and this whole issue of purpose is at the cross or core of the general teaching of Islam between you and God, and even in your outward actions when you relate with others.
This is interesting, and tied to what you've already said on consequences, it reminds one of the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ talks about somebody who insults his own parents.
Yeah.
And the Sahaba was, who would insult his parents? And the Prophet said, because that's really a bad thing, even to say uffin to your parents.
Of course, the least word of contempt.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And he said, it is the person who insults somebody else's parents, and someone else reciprocating in turn insults his own parents. In other words, you started something that resulted in your parents being insulted, was actually interpreted by the Prophet as you insulting your own parents.
Yeah.
So that we find, as you've already mentioned, there's the concern for what's your intention, but there's also the judging of the action based on its own consequences. Sister Salah, what could you add to this issue of the authority of this maxim?
Okay. Having listened to the different verses of the Quran and a hadith that Brother Ibrahim mentioned, one would say this reminds us of the discussion we had earlier, that the maxims, all of them, but now this one in particular, since we are discussing it, are based on so many textual sources of evidence that they are like those hadith mutawatir ma'nawi, that is hadith of multiple chain narrations that are similar in meaning. Because you don't hear, or at least I didn't hear Brother Ibrahim repeating al-umuru bima qasidiha. But every instance that he cited came back to that quality of the intention matters, the purpose matters, the consequence, the outcome. These things do matter. This is the reason why scholars do not argue about the authenticity or the veracity embedded in this particular maxim. It's so it's because that whole thing of being purpose-driven, thinking and being concerned about the consequences. This is actually one reason why during COVID-19, when many scholars had to give fatwa regarding things to do with praying in the mosque and going for Hajj and all of that a lot of the fatwa that came through were based in part on this particular maxim. And even where there were other examples to use, such as hadith about what the Prophet ﷺ said about pandemics and so on, those very narrations themselves give credence to this maxim, al-umuru bima qasidiha.
And thank you. I'd like you to, just follow up with this. What other legal maxims, what other principles have scholars associated with or have derived from this particular universal maxim? What are the children, if I put it that way, that come out of this maxim? What are other angles that this maxim actually covers?
Okay. As we mentioned earlier when we introduced this whole discussion of the Qawaid, that there are 5 core maxims, but in total we have about 1,000 plus, some that apply to specific fields. These 5 core maxims, with Al-Umuru Bimaqasidiha being one of them, are the maxims that are the parents, so to speak. Other maxims flow from them. So just as we are saying that you have a maxim that is rooted in a collection of ahadith and ayats, you also have maxims that can all be tied to one maxim. So when we look in the field of contracts, commercial transactions, there's a maxim that says that in contracts, liability is tied to or goes with or is based upon the meaning of words. What do the words mean? What is the intention or the purpose behind the choice of those words, and not the words in and of themselves or the form. This is separating the letter from the spirit. That when someone chooses to use a particular word, there is a reason why the person chose that word, not another. This is also important for contracts, because in many financial or contractual or commercial fields, they have their lingo. They have words that mean something very specific to their context, that if the word were taken out of context, the meaning would alter. So this maxim helps when it comes to interpreting the liability, the rights, the duties embedded within a contract. So look at the intent of the words chosen, look at the meaning of that word chosen. Don't stop at just what word was chosen and what was the form of that agreement. Therefore, when we take an example, for instance, from Islamic law itself, there is a distinction between what is profit and what is interest. Because the Arabic word riba can lend itself to those two interpretations. So if someone is saying, and even in normal business, some people will tell you, it's business and that's the profit, especially when you have these new forms of commercial transactions and forms of business or investments. What helps scholars, even today, to distinguish between what is interest and what is profit is by looking at not the words, not the form, but let's look at the meaning, let's look at the outcome, let's look at the consequence. What would the result be? That's one. Another one, maxim that connects with Al-Umuru Bimaqasidiha is the maxim that mentions that what matters is the reality, the reality, the essence of a thing. So again, just like the first one I mentioned, it's not so much the form, it's not so much the words in which this thing is clothed, but what is the essence of it, what's at its center. Let's give an instance. Once you hear ham, for those who are familiar with it, the first thing you think of is pork, that it's a way of preparing the flesh of pig. But we have what we call beef ham. In essence, ham is really, in essence, a particular way of preparing any kind of meat. However, if someone says, I ate ham, the conclusion might be, as long as it's ham, because we know that ordinarily, originally, that's pig meat, therefore, it's haram. The question is, no, what is its essence? That's important. Another way in which we see this particular maxim at play is the concept of the principle of istihala, that something might have an original form, but after it has gone through some processing, that form shifts or changes. And when the form changes, then the ruling that would be made with regard to that thing would change as well. So we might talk about, for instance, you talk about alcohol. If I were to say, okay, I want to drink alcohol, in that form, that's haram. But what if it appears as something used for cleansing? one's skin before a surgical procedure, would it still have that essence of something taken that turns the mind or clouds the reasoning? No. In which case the ruling would also have to shift. One more is that whatever is a prerequisite for an obligation is itself an obligation. So if there is something that is compulsory upon me to do, but there's something else that I must do that will lead to fulfilling that obligation, and that thing must be done. We tie that to the Fardu Kifaya concept, where with regard to Fardu Kifaya, it's saying that there's something that is compulsory on a community to do. So let's take an example of healthcare. That within a community, it is compulsory on the community to ensure that there is good healthcare and it's accessible. Now, who is to execute this? The question of who is to execute this would have to be answered, and only when it's answered, when some people are actually doing that job, will that obligation rest. That's one. Secondly, what is the prerequisite for ensuring that there is access to healthcare? It will differ from community to community. Some communities might require more medical personnel. Others might have medical personnel but require better roads or more affordable transportation. It therefore means whatever would lead to that maqsad being fulfilled, healthcare, life being preserved, has to also be done. It's now raised to the level of this is an obligation as well. So these are some of the ways that we can look at what other maxims are tied to this, but that are now specific to certain contexts or situations or fields.
Thank you very much. And I think just to reiterate an important point, the maxims that state that al-umur bi-maqasidiha, that matters are judged based on their purposes. You've mentioned some of the children or rubrics or sub-maxims to this maxim, such as things are judged based on their essence. You know, they say al-ibra lil-haqiqi la lil-alfaz, not just the wording. And important for Muslims to really look at the real essence of something, so that we are not hoodwinked by slogans and calling this Islamic or this is halal, nor should we even be quick to conclude something is haram without looking at the essence. What exactly are we talking about? And it's again interesting you raised the one of istihala, this change or transformation of things or substances from halal to haram, or from haram to halal, as fruit juice which is halal, but the maqasid, the objective is really just for a drink. It doesn't cause any intoxication. But when its attributes change, the ruling about it changes. When the same substance that was halal before it could intoxicate, now it's intoxicating, but because the consequence is intoxicating, then it is haram. But the same alcohol that then, by adding culture or vinegar to it, is processed and it becomes vinegar, which is no more intoxicating, because the consequence is not haram, the same drink becomes halal again. I also think the other maxim you mentioned, that things that lead to haram or are prerequisites to haram are haram themselves. Whatever is a prerequisite to a fard is also treated as a fard, especially in our environments where, as you've mentioned, you can get certain professions that are fardu kifaya. They are obligatory on the community. You gave the example of healthcare, security, agriculture, education, etc. But not just are these professions fardu kifaya, but whatever is a prerequisite, the education that you need to undergo, the university education is a fard if it is going to be a prerequisite to being a doctor. If being a doctor is a fard, then learning medicine is a fard. If learning chemistry and biology is a prerequisite to learning medicine, then that's also a fard. And if learning how basic maths or English or whichever language it is a prerequisite to biology, then that's also a fard. And I think these maxims and sub-maxims have a lot of implications to the importance of education generally, and not just what's traditionally called religious education. Malam Ibrahim, what other maxims can you share that are related to this big maxim of matters are judged by the purposes they fulfill?
Yeah, matters are judged by the purposes they fulfill, because, just to add actually, whatever leads to haram is haram. Not only that, whatever will lead to harm should be prohibited, just like the harm. You take example of our traffic rules. Because there is high probability of harm, if somebody violates it, then it becomes a rule too that is Islam is supporting. So whatever will lead to haram becomes haram in a number of ways. And that's why, like you said earlier, we shouldn't be bamboozled with the name because it is coming from non-Muslim. Now let's look at what objective it seeks to fulfill. Similarly, there is this qaida that the affairs of leader is dependent on the yani islahi ra'iyya. That is what makes the citizen or the subject, what is for the best interest of the subject. So it now make the leader now in a fixed, it gives limitation to the leader, and if only that will be obeyed, there will be no abuse of power, because no selfish interest in decision of a leader, or there should be no selfish interest, that the public interest should take precedence. So now this is it. Another thing is you look at ends, and sometimes you can forgive a mistake in the means but not in the objectives and the ends and what those things seek to fulfill. Meaning you can open temporary means to permanent ends. In line with that, you can allow some things that are haram of means. They are haram of means, but because of a bigger aim you want to achieve, they can be temporarily permissible. For instance, the only medical college available in that Muslim community is owned by non-Muslims, and they have a rule: you can't wear niqab, and you can't even wear hijab. But you look at having a medical practitioner, a nurse, and what have you, is a necessity for Muslims. They can send their daughters as long as they are not going naked. Is it not just cover up? Because this is a temporary situation that is leading to a permanent end. Also, you have qaidas like you can't justify, or there's no reward for unjust efforts. Meaning to say, you can't transfer ownership through theft. You can't steal a property, it doesn't become your own. There's no justification for a labor that the means to eat is haram. So all of these are qawaid, and a number of them that emanate from this al-umuru bimakasidiha. In essence, Islam is always concerned with what does it seek to achieve? What is it meant for? What is the intent behind it? And just like he mentioned earlier, it's not just matters, but even instructions. If a leader gives instruction, you look at why. To the best of our ability, this instruction is meant to fulfill this. Drugs, what are they meant for? Those who work as securities, including our professional careers, like you mentioned earlier, what role do they seek to fulfill? Forget about what you benefit. No, what role do they seek to fulfill? So these are some of the qawaid we can add.
Could you give a few examples of rulings or fatwas that have been arrived at as a result of the application of this maxim?
Yeah. Al-umuru bimakasidiha. Sometimes you can be a public officer and somebody give you a gift. Well, sometimes it is safer not to accept. Okay? But then, for the person giving, it depends on his intent, of course. Allah will only judge him based on his intent. If it's as a bribe, or a sort of payback, or pay forward now, or it's just a gift. All of these, we should be very careful. So sometimes you cannot conclude because you are not in people's minds. Remember somebody in the warfare said La ilaha illallah while he was attempting to attack the prophets. He did that for more than once, and the Sahabi, hastened to kill him. And the Prophet was saying like, أَقَتَلْتَهُ بَعْدَ أَنْ قَالَ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Did you kill him after he pronounced La ilaha illallah? The man said, Ya Rasulallah, but he said that just to save himself, The Prophet said, Ashakakata qalbahu. Did you open his heart? Like, were you there? So careful. Sometimes what these kind of fatwa scholars will tell you, when somebody say, I swear to God, that the oath is based on his intent, not on the intent of the person he's trying to convince. Because it's based on the intent of the person he's trying to convince. You outwardly, that's what you see. But if he's a trick, he meant something else, Allah will judge him based on that. That will not be called lagul yamin. Sometimes also you give aid to people, maybe food aid to a country, whether to actually help the poor or just to crush the economic system. Because sometimes there is kind of aid you give to a country where for the next 5 years the farmers don't need to farm again.
No more money.
The poor man will think that is good, but you have more poverty. So these kind of things, people should be careful. What is your intent? But not just as a country. Sometimes there's a kind of assistance you give somebody also. Your intention is what matters. Because there's one thing with human beings. There's every possibility for whatever good you do, you should be misunderstood. Your intention can be misinterpreted. But the most important thing, God will only judge and reward you based on your intention.
And it's interesting because, this question of how is a gift interpreted, it could be interpreted as just a gift. And the Prophet made it clear, as a Muslim, you should not reject gifts. You should not reject gifts, because unlike sadaqah, that is charity, which you can reject and the Prophet would reject, but you don't reject gifts. However, because of the concern for consequences, you find certain governments, certain schools, institutions, putting policies that gifts should not be accepted because the consequences that have been seen in that type of context have ended up morally compromising the independent decision-making of either staff in schools or government officials, etc. In some countries, they would even say a president is not allowed to accept gifts. They're never his personal property. When he leaves office, the gift was given to the president, so you drop it if you are no more president. So this issue of the concern for the consequences, creating rulings that sometimes actually go contrary to the hadith, but are in line with the spirit of the hadith. Thank you very much. And I think just to probably say a little more on the point you've made, which some might not appreciate, probably I think it was the point you made, how food aid, just like with technological aid, if not done in a sensible way, can actually end up creating more harm than good. So the intention is technological aid is good. The intention is food aid is good, and it is. It's just that it has to be done in such a way that it doesn't crumble the little market or the agricultural condition. If you bring in tons of free food into urban areas, the rural farmers can't sell their food. They can't get any money. And the next year's farming is going to even be more difficult because you've made the rural poor even poorer. The other example that comes to mind is that of surgery. Whether it is cosmetic surgery that is generally considered as prohibited, or whether it is corrective surgery, which is considered permissible. Same thing would be with sex alignment surgery. Is it done because somebody honestly feels I am a man trapped in a woman's body, and medical scholars and doctors confirm that, and they want surgery to change what they physically are like to, have that psychological balance. And fatwas have been given in most of the fatwa councils permitting that, as opposed to people who are just doing it because they can afford it and just want to see what it feels like to be in somebody else's skin, as it were. You've given a lot of examples of the application of this maxim to various contexts. You've moved from issues to do with fiqh to political policy, agricultural policy, education, technology, etc. I think it helps us appreciate why this maxim is actually a universal maxim. It is not tied to just one subject, but summarizes the spirit of Islam. And as you've already given that the authority of this maxim is it's established by so many texts, so many verses of the Quran, so many hadith, and one could even argue that all the evidence in usulul fiqh that is used to establish maslaha, that's used to establish saddu zariya, preclusion, or istihsan, all of these texts are also the texts used to establish this maxim, al-umur bi-maqasidiha, matters are judged by their purposes, their consequences, but also by their intentions. I'd like to thank you both for your contributions. Jazakumullahu khairan. Until next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu.